the password.
Well, that was creepy. Hey guys, and welcome back to my Bloodborne OneBro run. For those of you who've been following us so far, you'd know that I've got my axe to +6. And, you know, the secret to any OneBro run is always going to be you make maximum use of all the resources you have available to you. Now, in that regard, what I want to do in this episode is basically go through the Forbidden Forest, get to Iosefka's clinic, pick up the Cainhurst invitation and get to Cainhurst. The reason being that Cainhurst, in the early part of the game, before you get to Yahar'gul, is the only place you can farm bloodstone chunks. So we're going to need that to upgrade our axe to +7, which will make the next few bosses before we get to Yahar'gul a lot easier to handle. So one thing I want to talk about here is Madman's knowledge. I'm going to pick up some in a bit, but one thing I've never fully understood and something I'm really interested in is how Madman's knowledge works in the game world. You know, how do you acquire it? Obviously you get some each time you see a boss or defeat a boss, which, you know, basically you gain insight for these things, and it's basically what Madman's knowledge does, right? It gives you insight. But you can also obviously collect it, and that I found really strange. It just didn't make any sense in my mind. Why can I pick up this object that, you know, gives me insight? It just doesn't make any sense. And even stranger, I also pick it up from the remains of a person. I just never made any sense in my mind. But, you know, I've been looking around at other people's thoughts on this subject matter, and I have actually come close to understanding it a lot better now. So I just picked up some Madman's knowledge, and in a second I'll just show you the, if I can find it, I'll show you the item description. There we go. Making contact with the Eldritch Wisdom is a blessing, for even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose for posterity. Skull of a madman touched by the wisdom of the Great Ones. So if you look really closely, you can see in the skull itself there's the outline of a slug-like creature, and we all know that phantasms or invertebrates, depending on what you call them, are really important to the lore, the story of the game. You know, they're known as the familiars of the Great Ones, so there's definitely a connection between the two things. Now, at first I didn't really pay too much attention to the actual, you know, fact that you got the outline of an invertebrate in the actual skull itself. But now that I think about it, and I've thought about it for months and months, obviously not every day, but, you know, something I do think about once in a while when I'm playing the game, I think I realised that when you actually picking up the skull of the madman, what you actually get from the skull is, I suppose you'd call it like the dregs, or, you know, the bones, or, you know, like the cold shell of the actual invertebrate, which somehow got, you know, absorbed into the madman's mind. But look what happens when I use the madman's knowledge. You can see there's an object in my hand, so there is a physical object there, and when I crush it, this animation is so cool. You actually see, you know, part of the cosmos, part of the universe, and right at the very end of the animation, that gets absorbed into your mind. So that tells me that you are absorbing the actual knowledge itself, which makes sense. You know, this is something you acquire, so you gain insight each time. It makes sense. But that animation is very telling to me, because it's just, you know, it's an animation that, you know, shows you the cosmos, and the Great Ones are thought to exist within the cosmos, at least at some part of it, and the cosmos itself is somewhere you can actually, you know, it's a way to commune with them. And it seems as if when you actually gain insight, what you're doing is you're gaining a channel to communicate not communicate necessarily, but gaining a channel to the Great Ones. And if you think about it, since we describe, or the game describes, the madman's knowledge the invertebrates or phantasms as familiars of the Great Ones, that makes a lot of sense, because a familiar is a creature usually in folklore that has a connection to a being. So witches have familiars, cats, vampires have familiars like bats and wolves and such. And these phantasms are the familiars of the Great Ones. So I think what's happening is that when you're picking up a madman's knowledge, you're actually picking up like the frozen remains of the madman's mind, which are intertwined with the blood of the familiars. And when you crush them, you're actually crushing, I don't know, I suppose you'd call it like the last cold dregs of the familiar's blood, which is frozen, just like bloodstone shards are frozen blood. The same way I think the madman's knowledge is like the frozen blood of a familiar, which is part of the madman. And when you pick up the dregs and you crush it, you're gaining that insight, you're gaining the power of that blood that gets absorbed into you, and that's what gives you the power, or to actually it doesn't give you power, but it actually raises your insight. It increases your connection to the Great Ones, and that makes a lot of sense in terms of the mechanics of the game, because as you raise your insight in the game, the nature of the world changes. For example, you need at least one insight to speak to the doll, who is connected to the Great Ones for sure. Once you get to 10 insight and go to the Hemwick area, you'll end up finding the Mad Ones, which are the familiars of the witch there. And once you get to 40 insight, you can see the amygdalas in the Central Yarnum and in Cathedral Ward. So it's as if as you gain insight and as you gain the invertebrate blood, you get closer to the Great One's dimension. But I'm going to talk about something else now. This is really interesting as well. So I mentioned before that there was a comment that we find in the Healing Church workshop, which is left by the choir, and it reads, "The sky and the cosmos are one." Now, obviously, initially everyone assumed that just meant that there's a connection between the cosmos and the Great Ones, which was quite plain from that comment. But now that we've actually got the DLC, we know for a fact that the nature of the cosmos is that the world in Bloodborne is stacked. So dimensions are stacked on top of each other. And that's really interesting in the context of the tonsil stone. Because I'm just going to open it up now, and again, if I can find it, I think it's in the keys. I always forget where things are, so it takes a second for me to bring it up. Here we go, the tonsil stone. So, if you read it, it says a latticed, deformed rock, or perhaps a meteorite. Now that suggested to everyone straight away that this stone came from the sky, fell out of the sky. And everyone thought, oh, well, that kind of makes sense. The Great Ones live in the universe. So that's what it means. It's basically just a meteorite. But obviously we know now that because the dimensions are stacked on top of each other, this was probably either an object or even like the bones of a dead amygdala, probably a baby amygdala that's fallen from one of the higher dimensions. And the Nightmare Frontier, where we find the amygdala boss, is probably where this fell from, into the Yarnum dimension, and that's where whoever this guy is picked it up from. So I'm just going to pick up a armor set here, the White Doctor set. I think it's called the White Church set. Yeah, the White Church set, which is really important because it gives us very strong defense to arcane attacks, which you're going to need more and more as the game continues. Yep. He also has a high defense against poison, I think. Yeah, slow poison resistance 63, which is much higher than the standard Hunter's Garb. So I'm going to use that as I go through back towards Iosefka's clinic. So obviously there's a shortcut here, which most of you probably already know about. Back up to Iosefka's clinic. You get that really cool, eerie bit when you realise, oh my god, I'm back here again. It's really cool. I think there's some poison here. Antidote, yeah. Poison. So why these church giants are here, I'm not 100% sure. When I first got here, I thought it was really strange up here, and I still can't really explain why they're. I'm not sure if anybody has a particularly strong explanation, but it might just be a case of this is where the church giants are raised from. I said before that there's a theory going around that the church giants are dead Pthumerians that are being raised back as undead creatures, as servants of the church. And it kind of makes sense if they, if they were found underground like this. So maybe they're just left here when the church doesn't feel like they need them. Switching back to the Gascoigne garb, which I think is really cool. I quite like it. So when we get to Iosefka's clinic, we're actually going to find the Cainhurst summons. And one thing you're going to notice is that you'll find the summons on the table where, you were lying when you first received the blood transfusion. And I believe, and I think many people share this view, that the hunter himself, when you were starting the game, was actually heading towards Cainhurst. Now, whether that means that the hunter is somehow connected to Cainhurst, like, he was a child of Cainhurst that was smuggled out before the city or the castle was destroyed, I don't know. I think that's just pure speculation. But I do think that there's a strong connection between the hunter and Cainhurst Castle, purely because of the fact that, you had the Cainhurst, the summons when you came in. Of course, it could be a plant, but that doesn't really make too much sense in my mind, because who would have assumed that the hunter would eventually come back to the clinic in order to get the summons? Because you can only get back into the clinic through this specific way, and most players won't find it. I really hate those guys. I think I decided to skip him and just go, carry on to Cainhurst Castle. Ooh, gotta be careful there. But yeah, I think what's happening there, the story behind that is that because all the nobles of Cainhurst were basically destroyed, other than the queen herself, who was immortal, I think the queen was literally sending out invitations to Cainhurst Castle in order to find somebody that would have the strength to make it there, and she can make an ally of him or her. And I think, over time in history, that she's been sending out many of these invitations, and you're one of the people who found them. Another person might have been the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, who's obviously the other, who I assume is a Cainhurst hunter, but it's not 100% guaranteed. And maybe even Brador himself, who appears in the DLC, but don't really want to go into too much detail about that right now. But this is really interesting. So if you listen closely here, and I'll keep the game volume high, that sound that you keep hearing when you stand close to the Celestial here, who I think is Iosefka, to me it sounds like a sonar, or like a whale communicating. And I think that's really important, because one, the communication itself shows that this creature, the Celestial, is trying to get to communicate with someone or something. I assume the Great Ones. But the method of communication is really interesting to me, because if it's a sonar, and sonars are really, it's much easier to actually communicate through sonars and echoes in water. Water is a great medium for that. I have a personal theory that water is very important to the nature of the world in Bloodborne, and how different dimensions are connected to each other. I'm not going to go into too much detail now, because I'm just going to go to Cainhurst, but I definitely want to talk about that in more detail, either in this series, or I might even do like a lore video about it, because there's a lot of evidence in my mind that water is very important to the world and the nature of it. Perhaps not water, but just liquids in general. Alright, we made it to Cainhurst. I'm going to sign off there for now, and we'll continue from this point in the next episode. As usual, if you enjoyed it, like and subscribe, and if you've got anything to say, just leave a comment. See ya!